choose in the end, whether it's American or whether it's painted.
The question is, who gets to call it art? And the answer is sitting right next to me, Peter Rosen. Tell me about your film, Who Gets to Call It Art? What is the premise?
Well, you know, I'm not the one who gets to call it art. We did this film about a curator named Henry Geltzoller. And that's the answer. Henry gets to call it art, because this is really about this whole downtown art movement in the 60s in New York when pop art emerged through the eyes of this one guy, Henry Geltzoller, who, the more we researched this project, the more we realized he really did have a very unique set of eyes, because he saw things in those years, you know, now 40 years ago, 40 years ago,
Yeah,
45 years ago, that
Yeah.
have lasted. In other words, the paintings, the things that he spotted as being valuable and worth note are now the things that museums are paying, you know, up to $30 million for in some cases. So he kind of, over the years, it's sort of been proved that, you know, Henry really was the one who got to call it art.
And who is Henry specifically?
Well, you know, this might be the first film ever made about a curator. I don't even think a lot of people know what a curator does.
Well, this is their opportunity to find out. You learn a lot here at VVH.
You know, people who know the art world and know museums and all that know that a curator is somebody who kind of looks at the whole art scene and creates a show for a particular museum that he or she may work for. So it's not the kind of person you would think, you know, immediately, let's make a film about a curator, because it probably would be deadly. But Geltzoller became just the kind of glue to help us put together this whole survey of art in the 60s in New York, what was called the Downtown New York School. And as I said, that was the emergence of the whole pop movement and minimalism and some very interesting things that happened after this sort of period of abstract expressionism, which only very few people could understand. I mean, you know, if you look at a Pollock, you know, it looks like drips on a canvas to most people. Not that there's not intrinsic value there, and with Rothko, but these are hard things to understand, and in the whole country there were probably 400 or 500 people who were collectors or gallery owners or went to galleries. When pop art kind of exploded on the scene in the early 60s, the public immediately began to be interested in art. You know, art was on the cover of Life magazine, people began to go to these shows, and this is what the movie's about, this sort of whole experiment that turned into really the American art movement. There wasn't really an American art style before 1960. Everything was coming from Europe, or the artists who were here were trained in Europe or were followers of people like Mondrian and others who were, you know, from Europe. So it was a very interesting turning point in art. So in order to tell that story, we kind of found that by doing it through the eyes of a curator, we could, you know, glue it together a little better. It helped structurally to kind of build it around one person.
Well, it is interesting. I think a lot of people, not a lot of people, maybe there's some people that know a lot about art, but the average person may not, and see something and doesn't understand, well, why is this worth $2 million or $3 million? It looks like it's just a white line on a black canvas or something like that. So certainly this will be interesting for a lot of people.
Yeah, you know, we deal with that in the film a little bit, because the film, the last act of this film ends in 1970 when art became, you know, a real commodity. There were big auctions at Sotheby's and other places. So, you know, all of a sudden, big bucks were being spent on art. And up until that point, there, you know, these things where artists were getting $400 a painting, no matter who they were. So we have a kind of really interesting material that we found from some of the early art auctions in the 70s, and some of these artists were saying that this is the kind of the end of this really beautiful, interesting, innovative pop movement, because once money and the big dealers came into it, it changed drastically. And today I think the art world is as much big business and hype and marketing as the actual act of painting in a studio. So it's a very different times then and now. And some people from that period who we worked with in this film, we asked them to reminisce about the 60s, are very sad in a way that what's happened between then and now. They look at this movie and they say, oh my God, that reminds me of what a wonderful kind of experimental thing that was going on. Every day something new was happening, and all these artists who were doing new things didn't even know each other. This was all happening around New York by people who would do something one week, and 6 weeks later another innovative thing would happen, and they didn't even know each other. So it was a very interesting time, and I always wanted to make that film. It was sort of something I had on my mind. I was in art school in the 60s, so I kind of always knew these people and would visit their studios, but never could figure out how to make this film until now.
Well, speaking of these people, I mean, East End is full of revolutionary artists, always has been. Who can we see? Who will we see? What art will we see in this film?
You know, there's one local artist out here in Shelter Island John Chamberlain, who is one of the really major characters in this film. I mean, when you see, he's really very funny and one of these guys who represents that sort of macho 60s appeal and very politically incorrect. I mean, we had to tone him down a little bit in the cutting room, but they told it like it is, and they really, artists of that stature and that age don't really care too much about, whether there's what people think of them or whatever,
And there's a lot of buzz. I mean, every time I turn around, I hear about this film. A lot of buzz going on at this festival. Any distribution bidding wars or anything going on over this?
Well, that's why we brought this film here, and I'm not sure that people realize the filmmaker has to make a choice. There's just so many international film festivals out there, and when you come to the Hamptons with your film, you're pretty much knocking out your chances at, for example, Sundance, which follows this early next year. So we thought the Hamptons was a good place, just because of that relationship to films about art, the artists that were out here, as you talked about, and we hope to find a distributor here. I mean, that's why you bring a film to a festival. There have been some really good interest so far. It's a little early to mention any names, but there's a little bit beginning of a kind of bidding thing going on, which is what filmmakers like to see. And as you say, there was a buzz created through some pretty good articles that came out and some appearances on your show from when we were back in New York, and that's what you have to do here. It's sort of, there are 170 films, I think, here at the Hamptons Festival. So how do you get your movie to kind of get noticed is a challenge. If we knew all those answers, it would be great. But
it's interesting that you say that you have to really make your choice as a filmmaker which festival to put your film in, and obviously you find that there's a good fit here between the subject and perhaps getting a distribution deal.
That's why we chose the Hamptons, really, for that reason. This is a film about art, so it's not going to fit that well in some of the big festivals that maybe sometimes ignore documentaries or just specialize on Hollywood types of films. And this community really loves art. There are probably more galleries in the Hamptons per square mile than anywhere in the country outside of Soho in New York, I think. So, it's just the right community for us, and we hope, for this afternoon's, screening at 5 that we should have a pretty good crowd in Guildhall, and then Sag Harbor Saturday at 3:30, same thing. And it's going to be probably the best audiences this film's going to get for a while, because they are people who really care about art, know a lot about this history. And our subject, Geltzoller, lived in Southampton for the last 10 or 15 years of his life. There's a bench in front of the bookshop in Southampton. You ever seen that? It's got a little Henry Geltzoller.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and he had a beautiful house there. So he was a pretty well-known character walking along Main Street in Southampton, apparently, for all the years he was here. Wore a different hat every day, so people kind of would stop him and check out his hat each time he did that. I personally never met Geltzoller. I mean, this project sort of came to me quite a few years after he died. I mean, I knew who he was vaguely, but after spending a few years working on this, I think I know him pretty well now.
Not bad.
Yeah.
So he's the man who gets to call it art.
Henry gets to call it art, right?
Sounds good. Well, we'll be looking forward to seeing you around the Hamptons and seeing your film, of course. And again, now it plays, what is it, Saturday at Sag Harbor, did you say?
Sag Harbor Cinema, 3:30, yep, Saturday. Right, and today, 5 o'clock in Guildhall. And I guess I already mentioned, Guildhall really has special connotation for this screening. Not only is there a show of Robert Rauschenberg in Guildhall now, and Rauschenberg is a big part of this film, but also Henry Geltzoller, once he moved out here, he championed a lot of young artists. He gave lectures about art in Guildhall. And in the film, some of the voiceovers, some of the things you hear from Geltzoller are from some of the Guildhall lectures.
Interesting.
Yeah, so there are a lot of connections. Excellent. And my daughter Tanya lives here in East Hampton, in Springs, near where Pollock was, and of course de Kooning worked out here. So it's a perfect venue for our world premiere.
Excellent. Well, we wish you lots of luck, and we look forward to seeing it. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks.
And you'll find out if you see it who gets to call it art.
October 22nd.